They disrespected my mother on my wedding day. They thought I'd swallow it. I made them pay for every second of it.
My name is Zariah Coltrane, and this is the story of how my wedding became the day I stopped letting anyone decide my mother's worth, or mine. I always believed I could balance two worlds, the one I was born into, shaped by my mother Eunice's quiet strength, and the polished one Khalil's family lived in, where everything was curated, manicured, and measured by appearances. Growing up, my mother worked herself past exhaustion just to keep our lives steady, offering love when she had nothing else left to give. She taught me to walk into any room with my head high, even when people tried to shrink me with their eyes. Yet, as my relationship with Khalil deepened, I realized his family only saw her as a relic of my past, someone they assumed I'd outgrow. There were small remarks at first, like Bernetta's gentle digs about my mother's simple tastes, or her subtle comments about how I'd blossomed away from where I started. Khalil would dismiss it casually. "You know how she talks," he'd say, as if that excused everything. Looking back, those tiny moments were warnings I convinced myself to ignore. During our engagement, the divide grew sharper. Khalil's family loved the restaurant where we planned to host the wedding, my restaurant, though they never really asked. They told everyone how lucky they were that the venue had agreed to accommodate such a large event. They boasted about how the planner they hired had elevated everything, and each time I stayed quiet, smiling like I wasn't the silent co-owner who'd poured years into building that space. My mother, noticing my silence, would squeeze my hand and say, "Pick your battles, baby." I didn't have the heart to tell her that I wasn't picking battles, I was avoiding them. I wanted peace with Khalil's family so badly that I let their undercurrent of condescension wash over me without a word. Still, there were moments when the mask slipped enough to sting. At a family brunch, Bernetta mentioned how proper seating at weddings reflected family hierarchy. "Front tables for the important people," she added, glancing at me with something like challenge. Khalil chuckled, nudging me as if it was a harmless joke. My mother excused herself to the restroom, and when she returned, her smile was a little too practiced. Later that night, she said softly, "Some folks don't know respect until it's taught to them, Zariah." I wished I had her courage, her clarity. Instead, I told myself that once the wedding happened, once we were officially one family, things would settle. I clung to that belief even as their behavior chipped away at the edges of my calm. The week of the wedding, the planner, Taryn, barely acknowledged me during walkthroughs. She spoke directly to Bernetta and Khalil, referring to me as the bride, the same way someone might mention a distant detail in the decor. When I asked about seating arrangements, she gave me a tight smile and said, "Everything is handled, don't worry." She didn't know she was speaking to the person who approved every floor plan in that building. But I said nothing because silence felt easier than confrontation, and because I still hoped they would show my mother basic dignity without being told. On the morning of my wedding, as I fastened my veil and breathed through nerves I pretended were only about marriage, Eunice came to my dressing room. She wore a soft silver dress, her hair pinned with pearl clips she'd saved for months to buy. She looked radiant, proud, emotional, and fully present in a way that made my eyes burn. "You ready, baby girl?" she asked. I nodded, hugging her tightly. For a moment, it was just us, the world simple again. I didn't know it would be the last peaceful moment before everything shifted into a clarity I'd been running from for far too long. The lobby smelled like flowers and nerves when I finally stepped out of the dressing room. Musicians were warming up near the entrance, the soft murmur of strings blending with laughter and camera shutters. I stood just to the side, veil pinned, bouquet cradled in my hands, watching the guests filter in through the wide glass doors. Khalil's relatives arrived in little clusters, all polished smiles and coordinated outfits, pausing at the check-in stand where Taryn stood with her tablet and seating chart. She looked perfectly composed, the kind of woman who believed clipboard and headset equaled authority. For a moment, I pretended I was just another bride, letting everything float past me like a gentle tide. Then I saw my mother walk in. Eunice paused just inside the doorway, taking in the ballroom with wide, shining eyes. Her silver dress caught the light, the pearl clips in her hair making her look almost royal in a way she'd never call herself. She clutched that little silver clutch, the one she'd shown me 3 times the week before, asking, "You sure this isn't too much?" I watched her approach the podium, her shoulders straight, her smile hopeful. Taryn glanced up, gave a quick professional smile, and asked for her name. "Eunice Coltrane," my mother said gently. Mother of the bride. Those words should have meant something in that room. Instead, I watched Taryn's expression flicker as she scrolled, then tighten just slightly. "Oh, Miss Coltrane," Taryn said, her tone flattening. "You've been moved." The words sliced through the noise of the lobby, sharper than any music. From where I stood, I could see my mother's confusion, the way her hand tightened around her clutch. "Moved where, baby?" she asked, still polite, still calm. Taryn gestured toward the ballroom with a clipped little smile. "Table 12, she replied. Back there, near the column, we had to adjust some things to prioritize immediate family at the front tables. My chest constricted. I could see, through the open doors, the layout I'd approved days before in my own office, a layout where my mother sat near the head table, close enough to see every part of the ceremony and reception. This was not that layout. Before I could move, Bernetta's voice floated over from inside. "Just put her in the back. The front tables are for family," she said, like she was talking about a random guest who'd RSVP'd late. A couple of cousins laughed, the sound low and careless. Family. On my wedding day. My ears rang with it. My mother heard it too. I saw the tiny wince in her eyes before she smoothed her face into something softer. "It's all right," Eunice told Taryn quietly. "Just point me where you need me." She said it with the same humility that had carried her through every job, every long shift, every moment when people assumed she'd take whatever was left over. Watching her accept that table felt like watching someone lay a hand on my throat and press. Taryn led her past the main cluster of tables, all covered in gleaming glassware and towering centerpieces, toward the far corner of the ballroom. There, behind a massive decorative column that swallowed half the view of the dance floor and the head table, sat table 12. It was technically in the room, but it might as well have been in another building. From that angle, my mother would see flickers of movement instead of the first dance, half of the speeches instead of the full faces. I watched Eunice pull out her own chair, smoothing her dress as she sat down, her back a little straighter than before, as if she could hold herself together by sheer will. No one offered to help her. No one apologized. Instead, Khalil's aunt brushed past, giving me a quick once-over before whispering to Bernetta, "At least the important seats look right." I felt something inside me go silent, like a door closing softly but firmly. Khalil appeared near the edge of the ballroom, laughing with his cousins, oblivious to the quiet cruelty unfolding in plain sight. When he finally noticed me standing there, he grinned and walked over, eyes shining with what he must have thought was excitement. "You look incredible," he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "Everything's perfect." I stared at him for a long second, my voice stuck somewhere between my heart and my mouth. "Did you know they moved my mother?" I asked. The question landed like a stone between us. His smile faltered. "What?" he said, glancing over my shoulder. "Babe, it's just seating. There are a lot of people to arrange. She'll still see everything." I followed his gaze as he scanned the room, failing to notice the column that would block half of everything my mother had come to witness. "She's at table 12, I said, my voice lower now, tighter. "Behind the column, she heard your mother say, 'The front tables are for family.'" Khalil exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "You know how my mom is," he muttered. "She didn't mean it like that. Let's not make a scene today. We've worked too hard for this to be ruined over a table." Over a table. He didn't see what I saw, that this wasn't about table numbers or linen or event logistics. This was about a message, clear and calculated. My mother didn't belong at the center of my life in their eyes, even on the day that was supposed to honor both families. As he spoke, I watched my mother adjust her shawl and look toward the front with a small smile, pretending she couldn't hear the laughter that drew a line between us and them. I wanted to scream, to drag a chair to the head table myself and dare anyone to move it. I imagined walking to that corner, taking my mother's hand, and announcing to the room that she was the reason we were all standing on that polished floor. But then I saw the way Eunice glanced at me from across the room, offering a tiny, reassuring nod, like she was the one comforting me. She knew something was wrong. She also knew how much this day meant to me, how many nights I had spent planning, working, and convincing myself that I could merge these worlds without losing myself. In that moment, anger didn't explode. It compressed, turning into something sharper, denser, more deliberate. It slid into place like a locked piece of a puzzle, and I understood that if I reacted on impulse, they would call me dramatic, ungrateful, out of control. They would say, "See, this is why she doesn't belong at the front." I refused to hand them that story. Instead, I stood there in my wedding gown and felt the full weight of every moment I had stayed quiet for the sake of peace. Every time I'd let a comment slide. Every time I told myself it's just how they are, I thought of my mother standing in hot kitchens, serving other people's celebrations, never once asking for the best seat, just grateful to be in the room. And now, in the one place where she should have been honored first, she was hidden. My chest ached, but my mind began to move with a different rhythm. This was my venue. This was my contract. This was my staff. They might have chosen to forget who I was outside of the bride, but I suddenly remembered every detail. So I smiled at Khalil, a small, controlled curve of my lips that didn't reach my eyes. "You're right," I said softly. "Let's not ruin anything." He relaxed, misreading my calm for surrender. "That's my girl," he murmured, kissing my forehead before turning back to his cousins. As he walked away, I felt the last of my hesitation peel away like old wallpaper. If they wanted to pretend my mother didn't matter, they could do it somewhere else. Not in my house. Not on my dime. And definitely not on the day they thought they could push her into the shadows while basking in the glow of a room I had helped build from the ground up. I made my way toward the back corner where my mother sat, each step slow and deliberate. When she saw me, she smiled, her eyes softening. "Don't worry about me, baby," she said before I could speak. "I can see enough from here." I knelt beside her, careful not to crush the skirt of my dress, and took her hand. "You're not supposed to see enough," I whispered. "You're supposed to see everything." She looked at me for a long moment, something knowing flickering in her gaze. "Sometimes folks don't understand what they're doing until they're forced to look at it," she said quietly. "Just remember who you are." Her words settled into my bones. I kissed her cheek, straightened, and told her I needed to fix my lip gloss. It was a small lie, but it bought me exactly what I needed, an exit. The moment I stepped out of the ballroom and into the staff corridor, the air changed. The music and chatter dulled into a muffled hum behind the heavy door, replaced by the familiar clatter of plates and low voices from the kitchen. Back here, I wasn't just a bride in lace and tulle, I was a boss in disguise. The hostess did a double take when she saw me. Zaria, she stammered, catching herself before she used the title I usually wore. "Everything all right?" I forced a smile. "Everything's fine," I said. "I just need a quick second." I moved past her toward the small office off the hallway, the one where I'd signed contracts, run payroll, and stayed late balancing ledgers. It suddenly felt like the only honest room in the building. Inside, I closed the door halfway, enough to feel contained but not hidden. My hands shook slightly as I dug through my clutch for my phone, anger and hurt racing each other under my skin. I scrolled to Lennox's name, no title, no last name, just Lennox, because there was never any confusion about who he was to me. When he answered on the second ring, his voice sounded like solid ground. "Talk to me," he said. I didn't bother with pleasantries. "They pushed my mother behind a column," I said, hearing my own voice flatten the way it did when I was past the point of pretending. "At our wedding, in our ballroom, Taryn moved her to table 12 because the front tables are for family." There was a beat of silence, long enough for my heart to pound 3 times. Then Lennox's voice dropped. "You on site?" he asked. "In the hallway by the office," I replied. in a dress I paid for with deposits from this place. Don't move, he said. And don't confront them yet. I'm 5 minutes out. They signed a contract. They don't get to spit on it because they think you're just the bride. I exhaled, some of the pressure in my chest easing at his certainty. What are you going to do? I asked. What you pay me for, he said simply. Protect the house. A shadow passed across the glass inset of the office door, and I quickly ended the call, tucking my phone away just as Taryn appeared in the corridor, headset askew, tablet hugged to her chest. She paused when she saw me, eyes flicking from my hair to my dress, then to the office behind me. There you are, she said. We've been looking for you. We're about to start seating the last few guests. I stepped out fully, closing the office door with my heel. I was just taking a breather, I replied. Big day. She gave a practiced laugh. Tell me about it, but don't worry. I've got everything handled. All the key players are seated right where they should be. The words scraped against my nerves. Is that so? I asked, tilting my head. Including my mother? For the first time, something uncertain flickered across her face, quickly smoothed over with professional brightness. We had to make a few adjustments, she said. Your future mother-in-law felt strongly about front placement for her side. It's standard, really. Your mom still has a great view. I thought about the column swallowing half the room. Interesting definition of great, I murmured. Taryn shifted, clearly eager to end the conversation. Trust me, she said. Everything will look perfect in photos. She moved past me before I could answer, already back in her world of centerpieces and timelines, convinced that aesthetics mattered more than respect. As soon as she disappeared around the corner, I let my shoulders drop and leaned briefly against the cool wall. Part of me still wanted to march into the ballroom and drag my mother to the front myself, daring anyone to challenge me. But another part, the one that had survived years in this industry, knew that a quiet, well-timed move could land harder than any outburst. They didn't know who held the real authority here, and I realized I wanted them to find out in a way they couldn't spin or dismiss. If I said something, it would be the bride overreacting. If Lennox enforced the contract, it would be the venue protecting its standards. Sometimes power is not just about what you say, but who says it for you. I straightened, smoothed my dress, and walked back toward the ballroom entrance. Guests glanced at me with soft smiles and whispers of, "She's beautiful," as I passed, unaware of the storm quietly organizing itself behind the scenes. At the threshold, I paused, taking in the room with new eyes. The carefully arranged tables, the glittering glassware, the floral arch at the head table. All of it sat on top of years of my work, my late nights, my decisions. Somewhere near the back, my mother adjusted her shawl, pretending not to notice how far she was from the center. Near the front, Bernetta laughed with a cluster of relatives, her voice just loud enough to claim ownership of a space that was never hers. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the side door from the service hallway swing open. Lennox stepped through in a dark suit, no tie, his expression carved from stone. He scanned the room once, his gaze sharp and assessing, like he was taking inventory of something that didn't quite add up. When his eyes found mine at the entrance, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then he followed my line of sight to that hidden corner where my mother sat alone, and I watched his jaw clench. In that moment, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The stage was set, not by flowers or music, but by their own arrogance. They wanted control of the room. They were about to find out who it really belonged to. Lennox walked toward the head table with the same steady stride I had seen 100 times in investor meetings and difficult vendor calls. He did not rush, did not bark, did not demand attention. He simply took it. Conversations around him softened, eyes turning to follow the tall man in the dark suit who didn't look like a guest and didn't act like one either. Taryn spotted him first, her professional smile flickering uncertainly as he approached. "Hi there," she began, clutching her tablet a little tighter. "Guests aren't supposed to come through the service door, but if you need—" He cut her off with a small, polite nod. "You must be Taryn," he said. "Lead planner?" She straightened, relieved to be recognized. "Yes, that's right. Everything is under control." Lennox glanced at the seating chart in her hands, then at the tables spread out before us. "No," he said calmly. "It isn't." The room went a little quieter, like someone had turned down a dial. Bernetta looked up from her conversation at the head table, frowning. "Is there a problem?" she called out. Lennox answered without taking his eyes off Taryn. "There is," he replied. "This layout violates the terms of your contract with the venue." Taryn blinked, her confidence slipping. "Excuse me?" she said. "We made a few necessary adjustments for family priority. It happens all the time." Lennox tilted his head slightly. "Not here," he said. "Not without approval from the owner. And I don't recall signing off on any changes that involve relocating the bride's mother to a corner behind a structural column." A murmur of surprise rippled through the nearest tables, heads turning toward the back where my mother sat. Bernetta let out a short laugh that sounded more like a scoff. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, waving a manicured hand. "We discussed the seating with the planner. My side of the family needs to be up front. That's standard. I'm sure the owner wouldn't care about a little shuffle." Lennox finally turned his gaze on her, his expression unreadable. "You're right," he said. "The owner does not care about a little shuffle." For a heartbeat, Bernetta looked smug, as if she had won something. Then Lennox stepped aside and gestured toward the entrance, where I stood in my gown, veil catching the chandelier light. "She cares about the deliberate disrespect of her mother," he finished. "And she is very much here." Every pair of eyes at the head table swung toward me. The hum of chatter evaporated, leaving a thick, electric silence. Khalil stood slowly, his face draining of color as he looked from Lennox to me, then back again. "Zaria?" he said, like he wasn't sure which version of me he was addressing, the bride he expected to be quiet or the woman he was only now being forced to see. I walked forward, each step loud in my ears, despite the soft carpet. My heart hammered, but my voice, when it came, surprised me with how steady it sounded. "You bragged about this venue for months," I said, looking at his family, not at him. "You called it a blessing, a miracle, a sign that everything was falling into place. Not once did anyone ask why I knew every detail without needing an explanation." Taryn swallowed, glancing between us. I thought the owner was Mr. Ward, she said weakly. Lennox answered her, but his words were meant for everyone. I am the managing partner, he said. But the majority owner, the woman who signs the final approvals on events of this scale, the person whose name sits on those papers in the office back there, that would be the bride you have been treating like a prop in her own house. I felt the collective intake of breath around the room, the realization spreading like a slow burn. Someone at a nearby table whispered, "She owns it?" Another voice answered, "She co-owns it. That's what he said." Bernetta's mouth opened and closed before she found words. "You didn't tell us that," she said to Khalil, half accusation, half disbelief. He stared at me, genuinely stunned. "You never mentioned you were an owner," he said. The wrongness of his tone hit me like a slap. "I did," I replied quietly. "You just like the version where it sounded like a cute promotion more than the truth where I signed checks." My gaze left him and returned to Taryn. "So now that everyone understands where we are," I said, "let's fix the seating." Taryn's face had gone pale. "Of course," she said quickly, her voice trembling for the first time. "I'll move Mrs. Coltrane right away." She turned, nearly bumping into a server as she hurried toward the back of the room. I followed at a slower pace, feeling dozens of eyes on my back. My dress rustled softly, my veil brushing my shoulders, like a reminder I was still a bride, even in this moment of reckoning. When I reached table 12, my mother was already halfway to standing, confusion and worry etched across her face. "Baby, what's going on?" she whispered. I took her hand, helping her the rest of the way up. "What should have happened from the beginning," I said. "You're coming with me." We walked together toward the head table, Taryn scrambling ahead to clear a chair beside mine. Every step felt like I was rewriting the script they had written for us without consent. As we approached, the room shifted. Some guests stood instinctively, unsure of what else to do, while others stayed seated, staring as if they were watching a play they hadn't expected. I pulled out the chair prepared for my mother and guided her into it, smoothing the back of her dress like she had done for me countless times as a child. "This is where you belong," I murmured. Her eyes glossed with tears she refused to let fall. "You didn't have to do this," she said, voice shaking. "Yes," I answered, straightening. "I did." I turned back toward the room, my gaze finding Bernetta, who now looked smaller somehow, her certainty crumbling under the weight of so many witnesses. For once, she had nothing ready to say. Her lips pressed into a thin line, fingers twisting the napkin in her lap. Khalil stepped closer to me, lowering his voice. "You're making a scene," he said, the strain clear. We could have handled this later. I met his eyes, and for the first time, I did not soften my edges for him. "No," I said. "You were content to let my mother sit in the shadows while your family enjoyed the front row. This is the only time it means anything to correct it, right here, in front of the people who thought it was acceptable." A hush fell again, heavier this time, as my words settled over the room. Somewhere to my left, I heard Nyla whisper, "Good for her," under her breath. Lennox remained near the head table, arms loosely crossed, expression calm but watchful, like he was prepared to enforce the contract in more ways than one. The venue reserves the right to adjust seating in accordance with its policies and in defense of its staff and stakeholders, he said almost casually, as if he were quoting an invisible document. And in this case, the stakeholder is the woman you just watched walk her mother to the place of honor she was always meant to have. No one clapped, not yet. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was quieter, sharper, the kind of silence that comes when people are forced to see themselves clearly and don't like what they find. In that silence, I felt something inside me click into alignment. This was still my wedding, but it was no longer the one they thought they could choreograph. The center of the room had shifted, and this time it revolved not around Khalil's family's expectations, but around the woman who had carried me through every storm, and the daughter who finally decided she would not stand by and watch her be pushed to the edges ever again. The rest of the reception moved forward, but nothing felt quite the same. The music came back. The servers resumed their careful choreography with trays and glasses, and people tried to stitch the evening back together with small talk and forced laughter. Yet under it all, there was a new hum, low, constant, impossible to ignore. I watched it unfold from my seat beside my mother at the head table, feeling as if I were watching a film of my own life in real time. Every so often, Eunice would lean toward me and murmur something simple, like, "You look beautiful, baby," and it grounded me more than anything else. Her presence there, in that chair, was a correction to a story I had let run too long in the wrong direction. As I sat there, I couldn't stop replaying all the times I had chosen silence instead of confrontation. I remember dinners where Bernetta made comments about people who don't understand upper-tier etiquette and looked directly at my mother's thrifted dresses. I remembered the way Khalil would squeeze my knee under the table as if to say, "Don't start." I remembered swallowing anger with forkfuls of food, telling myself that enduring a few slights was better than risking tension. It had felt like survival back then, like the price of entry into a life that was supposed to be more stable, more secure than the one my mother had scraped together for us. What I hadn't noticed was how that survival mode slowly trained them to believe I would never push back. Sitting beside Eunice at my own wedding, I realized my silence had not been weakness, but it had been interpreted that way. I had stayed quiet to avoid conflicts, to keep peace, to protect her from seeing how deeply their words cut, but that same quiet had given them permission to move the line a little further each time. A joke here, a seating adjustment there, a decision made without me because they assumed I'd accept it. I saw now that my attempts to be gracious had been twisted into a license for disrespect. They hadn't just misread me, they had taken advantage of what they thought they could get away with. And I had helped them, one swallowed response at a time. When the toasts began, the contrast between words and reality was almost surreal. Khalil's cousin raised a glass and talked about two families becoming one, her voice ringing with practiced warmth. I watched Bernetta's face tighten slightly whenever eyes shifted toward our side of the table, as if she could feel the scrutiny pressing on her from across the room. She tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. My mother listened politely, clapping when everyone else did, never once betraying the hurt she'd felt earlier. I knew it was there. I had seen it in the way her shoulders had folded in on themselves at that corner table. But now, in this moment, she sat with a quiet dignity that made their earlier treatment look even smaller. At one point, Khalil tried to salvage the evening with a speech of his own. He stood, glass in hand, and thanked everyone for coming, his voice a little too loud, a little too brittle. Today is about love, unity, and moving forward, he said, glancing at me as if asking for confirmation. Sometimes little misunderstandings happen, but what matters is that we're all here together. I felt the room shift as he spoke, like people were waiting to see how I'd respond. I held his gaze, but I didn't nod. I didn't smile to smooth things over. Instead, I let the silence stretch just a second too long after he finished, a thin crack in the image he was trying to restore. Then I raised my glass for my mother. To Eunice, I said, the first person who ever believed I deserved a seat at any table, and the last person I will ever let be pushed to the back. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was real. As the night wore on, the whispers grew more focused. Guests approached my mother, complimenting her, apologizing in vague, stumbling ways that never named what they had witnessed, but acknowledged it all the same. "You must be so proud," one aunt said, her voice softer than it had been earlier in the evening. A younger cousin from Khalil's side, Nyla, came over and hugged me tightly. "I'm sorry," she whispered into my shoulder. I didn't know they moved her. I shouldn't have kept my mouth shut when I heard them talking about the seating. I pulled back and looked at her, seeing a version of myself from a few years ago, caught between loyalty and discomfort. "You know now," I said gently. "Next time, say something, even if your voice shakes." Meanwhile, the cracks in Bernetta's facade widened. Relatives she usually commanded with ease seemed less eager to be seen at her side. One of her sisters questioned her quietly near the dessert table, their conversation low but tense. I watched Bernetta gesture toward me with a sharp motion, her lips moving faster, her eyes flashing with a mix of frustration and embarrassment. It was the first time I had ever seen her truly off balance. She had built her world on control of narrative, of social order, of who belonged where. Tonight, that structure had been publicly challenged, and no amount of charm could erase the image of her son's bride walking her own mother from the shadows to the place of honor she had been denied. Khalil drifted between tables, trying to patch up what he could. I saw him lean in to talk to his friends, saw the way they nodded sympathetically, but glanced toward me with something like caution. Eventually, he made his way back to where my mother and I sat. "Can we talk?" he asked, leaning down so only I could hear. I stood, motioning for him to follow me to a quieter corner near the floral arch. The music softened as a slow song began, couples drifting to the dance floor. The contrast between their swaying bodies and the tension pulling at his jaw felt almost unreal. "You didn't have to do all of that," he said as soon as we were alone enough. "You could have told me, and I would have fixed it." I stared at him, exhaustion and clarity mingling in my chest. "You saw where my mother was sitting," I replied. "You heard what your mother said. You didn't need me to tell you anything." He scrubbed a hand over his face. "This is just how she is," he insisted. She doesn't think about things the way you do. Making a spectacle out of it is only going to make things worse between you. I felt a bitter laugh rise, but I swallowed it. You think this was a spectacle? I asked. No, what your family did to my mother, that was the spectacle. I simply refused to let it go on without consequence. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, a flicker of something like doubt crossing his features. So what now? He asked finally. Are you going to hold this over my head forever? I looked past him for a moment, watching my mother on the other side of the room. She was talking to Lennox, both of them smiling in that quiet, genuine way that comes from shared history. It struck me then that my future couldn't be built on someone who needed me to stay small for his comfort. What happens now, I said slowly, is that I stop pretending disrespect is something I can live with, not toward me, and definitely not toward her. I met his eyes. If you want a wife who will swallow this kind of thing to keep the peace, you chose the wrong woman. The rest of the night passed in a blur of dancing, conversations, and long looks that said more than words ever could. Some guests left early, uncomfortable with the shift in power they had witnessed. Others lingered, drawn to the honesty of what had happened, even if they didn't say so out loud. When the music finally faded and the lights softened, I walked out of the ballroom with my mother on one side and Lennox on the other. The three of us stood in the empty lobby for a moment, the quiet almost echoing. You all right? Lennox asked. I nodded slowly. I think I am, I said. For the first time in a long time. In the weeks that followed, the story of that night traveled far beyond the walls of the restaurant. People talked about the bride who owned the venue, about the groom's family who tried to hide her mother, about how the planner had nearly cost herself a professional reputation by siding with the wrong kind of priority. Some retellings were messy, colored by bias or discomfort, but the core truth stayed intact. I had stopped being quiet. And that, more than any floral arrangement or curated playlist, defined my wedding day. Bernetta's social circle shrank as more people began to notice patterns they had previously ignored. Invitations she would have received automatically became less frequent, replaced by polite distance. For me, the consequences were different, but no less powerful. I found that once you break the habit of apologizing for your own presence, it becomes harder to slip back into it. At work, I stopped letting Lennox carry all the visible weight of ownership. I attended more meetings, introduced myself with my full title, and watched as people adjusted their assumptions in real time. At home, I began noticing how often I'd softened my tone, edited my words, or laughed off things that didn't feel funny. I started choosing honesty instead, even when it made people shift in their seats. The better I got at recognizing that discomfort, the less responsible I felt for easing it. As for Khalil, we tried to talk more than once. We spent long evenings going over what had happened, circling around the same truths. He wasn't a monster, and I wasn't a martyr. We were two people whose values had diverged quietly over time. He wanted harmony at any cost, even if that cost was my voice. I wanted a life where respecting my mother wasn't negotiable. In the end, that gap was too wide to bridge. We didn't erupt in drama. There was no screaming, no shattered glass. Just a final, heavy conversation where I said, I won't start a marriage by teaching myself to be small, and he didn't have an answer that could hold both of us. We parted not as enemies, but as two people who finally saw each other clearly. Looking back, I realized my silence had once been a way to survive, to navigate spaces that weren't built with women like my mother and me in mind. It had kept us safe, in a way, but that same silence, left unchecked, had begun to erode something more important: my sense of worth, my boundaries, my belief that I was allowed to take up space without apology. On the night of my wedding, I reached a point where staying quiet cost more than speaking up ever could. That was the moment everything changed. My voice stopped being something I rationed and became something I trusted. Now, when I choose to be quiet, it isn't because I'm afraid or trying to keep the peace at my own expense. It's because I understand that my silence is mine to give, not theirs to demand. It can be a boundary, a pause, a decision to walk away instead of engaging. But it will never again be permission for anyone to push my mother or me into the shadows. I carry that night with me everywhere I go. The sting of seeing her hidden, the power of walking her to the front, the echo of my own voice filling a room that was always, in truth, mine. In the end, my wedding wasn't the fairy tale I once imagined. It was something harder, sharper, and ultimately more honest. It was the day two worlds collided, and I chose mine. It was the night a room full of people watched a woman they thought they could sideline, stand up, and rewrite the rules in real time. And it was the moment I understood that the most important vow I would ever make wasn't to a man or to a crowd, but to myself and to the woman who raised me. Never again will I let anyone decide our place for us.